The Meadowlarkers are back. I'm Kate Fagan, joined by Howard Bryant, Amin Elhassan. Guys, the news cycle has already dealt with the specifics of Aaron Rodgers' behavior as it comes to the vaccine and whether he lied or didn't lie. The conversation we want to have today is a specific one about language. And we've touched on it in previous weeks. And I think it's appropriate that that clip from Aaron Rodgers on the Pat McAfee show ends with the phrase witch hunt. This is interesting to me because in my recollection of what witch hunts were, they were groups of men hunting witches, not the way it is used in this day and age. And I think that's a good jumping off point to this idea of the concept of woke, the concept of cancel culture. We can touch on witch hunt if we want to, but let's focus on woke and cancel culture first. And Howard, I'll just pass the ball to you here. When it comes to this topic of language and this Aaron Rodgers story, where does your mind go?
Well, my mind takes me to the celebrity culture in general. It takes me to all of the language that we've been hearing, whether we're talking about Dave Chappelle or talking about Kevin Hart or talking about every congressperson in the world using the word woke because it's a political dog whistle now. It is, and for me personally, I think that it's become one of those words where it is a pejorative. Joel Anderson on Slate put out a tweet the other day that said something like, if you're a white person using that word, it is the equivalent of a slur. And to me, I look at it this way. You know what you're doing. And it's the same as using thug for black or urban for black, or it's just coding. It's more and more coding. And in these times that we're in right now, there's a certain half dozen words or so, woke being one of them, one of the great hijacked words, that when I hear people say it, I look at them differently because I don't want to be gaslit. I don't want the dog whistles around me. And when I hear that, it's a tell. It's not what you think you're saying. And so I think it's two-pronged. I think the first prong is this is the sort of celebrity gaslighting of anybody who says something that, in order to deflect any sort of consequence, they consider themselves persecuted. It's a witch hunt. It reminds me of steroids in that regard. But on the other hand, it's also when I hear people use that term, and especially when I do hear white people use that term, it feels very anti-black. It feels very, it's a hostile term. And it makes me look at people differently when I hear it. Because it's like, I don't think you're saying what you think you're saying. And if you are, we probably don't have a whole lot to talk about.
I've at least gotten to this place over the last couple years with a handful of words that I years ago used and I believed they had actual meaning, and now the meaning has been robbed from them, and I try to avoid them. And and here I'm thinking of words like privilege. Privilege is an actual word that historically has a very specific meaning. It's a word that until the last couple of years I could use in a way and think it was simply conveying an idea to somebody. It wasn't conveying a political ideology. It wasn't it wasn't charting out ground for me as a left-leaning progressive. I just thought, privilege is a thing that exists and you use it in certain contexts. Now that word in particular, I avoid it completely because I don't, if the point of language is to convey ideas to somebody else and to share the human experience with someone else, there are words like privilege, like trigger, like problematic. And within that grouping, I would also add woke, cancel culture, these words that you don't convey meaning and share your experience. It just sort of shuts down any communication and seems to people infer that you believe certain things, that you are somebody. And so it's almost like robbing words of their meaning or just co-opting them for something completely political. And I find my way trying to communicate the idea of privilege without using the word privilege, just because if I'm trying to communicate with somebody, I know people will shut down around certain words.
Right. That's interesting. I didn't think about how far out some of that reach would go. I think, first of all, Aaron Rodgers started in that very short sound with 4 of the buzzwords. Woke, cancel culture, witch hunt, and then what was the 4th one? I can't remember what the 4th one, but there was. Yeah, there was this, it's just, and these are all of the, you talk about dog whistles. These are all the coded language to appeal to a certain segment of the population. Now, the one thing where I will disagree with you guys on is I don't believe it is necessarily, although it happens a lot, along racial lines. I think it happens along the lines of a portion of the population that feels like they're not allowed to even broach topics without the tarring and the feathering. And what I mean by that is when you think about who Aaron Rodgers is appealing to when he says those words, it's a group of people who don't have a political ideology necessarily, who don't have a single race. It's diverse in racial makeup. It's diverse in socioeconomic makeup. Because I know a lot of black people and a lot of less fortunate people and a lot who are just feel like some of this stuff, when you broach the topic, you're automatically shouted down. Now, this isn't a defense of Aaron Rodgers. He lied. He talked about blatant lies. He blatantly lied when he said yes when asked if he was vaccinated. But who he's appealing to are the millions of people who feel that feeling of, wait, I can't even ask about this vaccine. I can't even, gather a little bit more information. Now, the difference between him and those millions is they don't have access to the best doctors and epidemiologists and other things of that nature. He does. And he's being less than truthful when he talks about his own research or you want to talk about a word that was co-opted, the word immunization. He co-opted it when he said, yes, I'm immunized, right? But the people he is signaling to, they don't. And that's who he's trying to conscript to be his own masses or his own army to say, hey, leave Aaron Rodgers alone.
Yeah, I'm not sure I buy that.
You don't think it's calculated in that way?
No, I don't think I buy the fact that the people he's talking to don't have an ideology. I think that things do go across board, but when I say it does go across racial lines, I'm talking about the co-opting of the word. The word woke belonged to black people. The word woke several years ago, not even 5 years ago, meant you having a sort of, as a black person, having a sort of racial awakening about how things are, or about being able to embrace certain pieces of a dynamic that has affected you and your generations for centuries. And the fact that that word has been taken is absolutely in its root racially based. It's a way of saying that you're taking over and we don't want to adapt and we don't want to adjust. And so when you start to, it becomes a political term, it becomes a left-right term, which is a way in so many different ways that even that black terminology gets taken by, it's not left and right, it's black and white, right? You start taking these terms, you're hijacking these terms, you're weaponizing these terms. And when you use these terms as a weapon and they get turned back on you, that does not suggest at all that there's no ideology in place here. There's absolutely an ideology in place.
I guess what I would say is that, yes, there are people who do that. And then, yes, there are a lot of black people in this country who use woke as a pejorative as well.
Yes, absolutely, they do. But what I'm saying is that when you start taking when you use that term, all right, when you're using the term woke the way it's being used now, right, a lot of people, when I hear it, it's being used against whatever constituency you believe is taking something that you believe was yours. That when people begin to express a little bit of empowerment, woke was used as anti-black. Woke is used as anti-left. Woke is used, whatever woke is anti, right? Whatever that ideology is, it's anti that. And so when I hear that, and when it's being signaled, the same way cancel culture is is a signal. We live in a time where words are absolutely being weaponized with very specific purpose. And usually that specific purpose is somebody who fucked up trying to make it seem like they didn't. And that there is a group of people today who are so oversensitive, or who are trying to take away simple dialogue or take away my freedoms, whatever it is. It is a culture war. The terms have very, very specific meaning and very, very specific intention. And usually that intention is to try and deflect from whatever it is that you did. In Aaron Rodgers' case, you lied. And so instead of talking about the context in which you told the public something that wasn't true, you're going to use the witch hunt, woke, cancel culture weaponry to take yourself off the hook, when really this isn't about all of that. It's just about you and what you said.
Avoiding consequence. He's trying to avoid consequence for his words.
And
his
using
actions.
your position. That's right. I mean, using your position, and that's where the power piece comes in. That's where the celebrity piece comes in, because these guys have so much juice. You put a microphone in front of Aaron Rodgers, people are going to listen. You put a microphone in front of Kyrie Irving, people are going to listen. You put a microphone in front of Donald Trump, people, it's all the same. It's the power piece of this. And it's a way to crush your enemies, in a sense, because it feels like every person can be like, yeah. Like the dude who can't make the anti-gay slur is the same one who would be upset about the anti-black slur, but they're two different constituencies, and woke covers both of them. So now they connect.
It seemed like there was this moment, many moments over the last few years, and then specifically in 2020 after George Floyd, where there was no cover. There was just one moment where it was like, are we actually going to address certain things that exist in this country? Are we actually going to face them? And a lot of white people I knew were like, shit, I need to face this. And then all of a sudden you started hearing woke mob, cancel culture even more. And it was like, oh, this gives me an out. I don't actually have to acknowledge real things. I can now grab onto this life raft of cancel culture, and I can avoid having to deal with what is actually the undercurrent of all of it. But just because I think it's important, I think you were kind of alluding to this a few minutes ago. I think we should start from a foundational piece of among the three of us, do we believe that there is right think right now, right speak? If you're alluding to the George Orwell 1984 novel, do we think right now in our culture that it is true when people suggest there are some mistakes you can't make, some things you can't say? Is that true, Amin?
I think that there is, in a corner of the internet, most of it is Twitter, and most of it is people who have some sort of platform of their own. There is an attitude of, there's some things you can't even question. And I don't mean question in terms of I don't think it's true, but question in terms of wait, how can I learn more? Or asking an innocent question about. There are some things that there is a kind of a barrier there. And as a result, corporate America follows what they feel is what the ultimate movement is. Does that happen to every single person? No. Does that happen in every single one of these infractions? No. But I do feel like there are certain things that would be a great topic of discussion if we were allowed to have open discussion. But sometimes we don't, because it just feels like if you're not in line with these certain things right here, that means you're on the other side. And the reality is we're all very more complex than being able to choose one of two sides when it comes to certain issues.
Did you think, answering that question felt like if you answered it wrong, it would have been a form of a mistake?
So I was like, let's use this as an example. Like, I can't, because if I do, that'll
Well, let me throw one out to
prophecy.
you, because it just popped into my mind. Back when I was at ESPN, I don't think I was still doing a radio show with Will Cain, but maybe I went on the afternoon one that he was doing. And it was the week that I think it was the Arizona Cardinals had hired a woman on staff, on their coaching staff.
Right. Yeah.
I don't even remember what coaching position she got hired on, but it was very clear that the only response you were allowed to have about that was that this was phenomenal and great and awesome. Of course, Will Cain did not hold that position necessarily, but I remember thinking, oh, nobody's going to speak honestly about how they might feel about that.
So you just sparked a great example, that one that I have said out loud. And, obviously I wasn't canceled or anything, but I was definitely shouted down despite me. I don't think I expressed myself in a way that was misogynistic or prejudicial in any way. 3-4 years ago, Becky Hammon was behind the bench in San Antonio, and people were demanding that she get interviewed and get a job somewhere as a head coach. And what I said was, typically in the NBA, this is the progression. You go from behind the bench to front of the bench, and then that's when you start getting noticed for jobs elsewhere. And then the rebuttal was, what about Jason Kidd? He went from playing to just coaching immediately. What? And the other example, I said, the NBA has always been like this. The players built this league. The players sold this league. The players do everything. As a result, when they're done playing, yes, they get shortcuts. I wanted to work in the front office. I had to do shit for 9 years in order just to be in a position where I was, where I was, right? Same thing with coaches. Steven Silas was an assistant coach for 21 years, was a video coordinator, was an advanced scout, did all this stuff. If you're a player, you get to shortcut that, because the thing is, I point to my playing career as my eating shit days, right? The eating shit is for the rest of us, those of us who didn't play. Becky Hammon, she played in WNBA. She had an illustrious career in Europe. She played in the Olympics, all that stuff. That's great, but none of that matters. In the same way that David Vanterpool had a long, illustrious career in Europe, and that didn't matter. You have to go through the process. And people told me, I hate women, and I'm just diametrically opposed to the idea of a woman being a head coach. That's what happens. Obviously, it's a very small scale. I don't have that big of a platform. Not that many people are talking to me. And nothing happened because, in my case, nothing happened. But there is a feeling. I'd be lying to you if I didn't feel like, before I said this on air and before I tweeted it, am I taking my career at unnecessary risk to make a point that, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, I don't really give a fuck about? I can go home and not say anything about this, and she gets an interview, she doesn't get an interview, who cares? But I felt like, hey, my job is to kind of explain the NBA to people. It's not misogynistic in that regard. And instead of people saying, maybe, or having a discussion, it was a very loud and rebuking of, how dare you say that? And then what happens after that? The other thing I said was, anytime someone says to me, a writer writes about this guy's going to be a great head coach, I say that's bullshit. The only way you know if someone's going to be a good head coach is if you've seen them be a good head coach somewhere. You might have an inkling, but from talking to them, if you've worked with them, I believe it. So if, to use an example, if Rick Carlisle had told me Steven Silas is going to be a great head coach, I won't say, how do you know? Because I know, Rick Carlisle coached with the guy. He knows the guy, right? As opposed to Tim McMahon, who's my friend. He covers the Mavericks for ESPN.com. If he tells me Steven Silas is going to be a great coach, I'm like, why? Because Rick Carlisle told you that? There's a difference there between, I heard that he would be, and he will be, or she will be, and I heard that she will be. But people didn't want to hear that. They didn't want to hear the reality that, hey, maybe we don't know at all. And maybe that there is a process by which people who are not players go through before they get to the point where they have these opportunities available to them. That to me is a small, my own personal example of something where you're asking me about. Where do I feel like there's a place where you can't always say what's on your mind, even when it's well thought out, even when it's reasoned, and even when it doesn't come from the ugly, negative places that people are purporting it to be from.
Yeah, but you know what? That's no different than your entire life. What's different is the fact that the people who historically have gotten punched in the face every day and couldn't say anything, now they can say something. Because I guarantee you, there are many, many times when you say, oh, is there a groupthink taking place? Sure, there's a groupthink. I have a problem with American foreign policy. You get crushed for that. You get crushed for that the same way you would get crushed if you said something about Becky Hammon not being a head coach. There are all kinds of different things. If you go up against, it's called being a dissident. It's called being a protester. All of these different things that we've protested. The difference is who's mainstream and who's not mainstream. And the reason why people get so upset about it now is because the people who have not been mainstream for all these generations and couldn't talk, now they can talk. And now there's a consequence for shitting all over them. You can't do it the same way you used to do it in the past. But that's not to say that in the past you could dissent. You couldn't. You just couldn't dissent against the machine, against the majority, against the bigger. If you went out and said, gee, why is it that Willie Randolph couldn't get a head coaching job? It's because I'm black. He would get demolished. In 1990, Jose Canseco gave an interview, of all people, talking about how, black and Latino, how the black and brown in baseball have no future in the sport. He got demolished, canceled. The same stuff we're talking about now. Back when Reggie Jackson in 1987 said, how come there are no black owners and no black managers? It's because we're black, right? He got crushed the same way you'd get crushed if you said, gee, I really think that, I don't think there should be female coaches on the sidelines, right? It's all the same. The difference is who has the cannon pointed at them, and that the cannon has suddenly turned, and now, and to your point earlier, Amin, what's really driving all this isn't you, isn't me, isn't Kate. It's the fact that now there are corporate dollars at stake and they don't need the headache. And guess who's doing the hiring and the firing? The same white people who are complaining about cancel culture. They're the ones doing the canceling. Right. Because they don't want to deal with a new workforce where you actually have to navigate and deal with new people and new opinions. So a lot of times what happens is they just say, oh, Amin said something controversial. We don't need the Twitter backlash, even though there may not even be a Twitter backlash. We're going to get rid of you. Who's making that call, right? To me, most of us, we can handle the banter. I'm not out there trying to get people to lose their jobs and have to apologize and shit and all that stuff. I've always said, and Kate, we talked about this the other day, and I mean, social media exists to get you fired, right? I mean, so what we're really talking about is that there's a difference of, what's the best way to say it? There is an attack taking place for a lot of nefarious purposes. A lot of the stuff we all talk about anyway, just not necessarily in the public sphere, because these corporations who are now running pulling all the strings, they've decided that they don't need the heat and they're getting rid of the individual.
I worry, or I think frequently about the fact that it feels right now like the power, like if we say cancel, if we say cancel culture in air quotes here, if we believe this is actually a thing, that people are actually being canceled, right?
Which they're not.
Right. They're not. And that's, to me, it's like you say the cannons, right? The cannons have been pointed elsewhere. What are those cannons right now? They are basically Twitter, social media, which is a tiny fraction of the population who's actually on these things, which then leads to maybe some media outlets noticing some shit's going down on Twitter, and then they do a think piece about so-and-so said some dumb shit on Twitter and now they're being canceled. So now you got a piece on Vulture about a couple dozen people or a couple hundred people on Twitter who are pissed about what something somebody said. So then it gets to some media outlet, which then means if they're the spokesperson for something, some company cares.
Yeah, Kate, but that's not what I mean by canon. Those canons, absolutely. And that leads more to the idea that everyone's trying to get everybody fired. Like if you've got a blue check, somebody's trying to get you fired. What I meant by canon was the people in the playground who had to take it now actually have some recourse against slurs. Like those individuals. Like, so when you say you can't say that anymore, it reminds me of the time, like baseball's full of slurs. Like 1960, Pumpsie Green, the first black player to play for the Red Sox, is warming up on the field with Ted Williams. And another Red Sox player, is dropping N-words left and right, because that's how everybody talked back then, right? And one of the players, I think it was not Johnny Pesky, maybe, went over to this other player and said, "You can't talk like that now. We got Pumpsie on the team." Right? Yep. In other words, the language shifts because the people shift, right? I mean, when your workforce shifts, now you have to pay it. We don't call flight attendants stewardesses anymore, right? All of the language, the whole culture has to go along with a new paradigm.
So, but let me just, I take your point about the canons pointed. I think that the point I'm trying to make is that it feels that it's hollow, that we think that the majority of people must feel this way because you got a couple angry people on Twitter and media has said, how dare you say that there should be no female coaches in the NFL? Mm-hmm. And then to the person, it feels like, oh, I guess I've crossed some boundary and nobody agrees with me because I got a couple hundred people on Twitter and a few media outlets wrote it up. But the reality is that you walk into the bar and the population still mostly agrees with you. And so we've got this weird paradigm that has been created where it's like it's this shadow sphere of media and social media where it seems like the reality is you can't say this, you can't say that, you can't think wrong, but it doesn't actually reflect the population's thinking and feeling. And so where do we go from there when it's like, I can't say this because I think I'm quote unquote canceled?
Who's making the call? That's my point. No, sorry, Amin, go ahead.
No, so to give an example of what Kate's talking about, Tom brought this up the other day when we were all talking to each other. There was a tweet where there's a media member who posited the question over under how long it takes the crowd to boo Aaron Rodgers on Sunday. And I believe the person asking the question earnestly believed that Aaron Rodgers was going to be like a pariah because he's a pariah on Twitter and among us smart people doing podcasts and radio, etc. And the reality is, in that stadium, he's going to have way more people cheering him, to Kate's point, than people saying, "Oh, shame on you." Because regardless, and it has nothing to do with the vaccination status of these people, and it has nothing to do with whether or not he lied. It has everything to do with the idea that he has now painted himself as this martyr of this unfair prosecution by these people, woke cancel culture mob, crew. And the people in that stadium are saying, yeah, I'm sick and tired of that shit. And the reality is, I think there are more people like that than there are people in the actual quote-unquote woke cancel culture pariah mob.
And a thought I'm trying to work through right now is, like, Howard, to your point a couple of minutes ago about examples, 50, 60, 70 years ago where you would get quote-unquote canceled if you said, well, why didn't I get hired? Because I'm black. And you would that's not something you would be able to say. It feels like... And
that was true.
And it was
you still
true.
got canceled for it.
Yes. Yep. And now we're in this inverse land. We're in an inverse land where now you can't say the opposite of that, right? You can't say, well, I didn't hire someone because they were a woman or because they were black. And then you get canceled in a hollow space that doesn't have a ton of real power. Occasionally you'll see power if a company comes in and says, well, we don't want to be associated with that person anymore. But you then get persecuted in a hollow space that doesn't have a ton of power. And so it's like this inverse world that we're living in, and the cancel culture feels like the bridge back to the old world. The bridge back to 50 years ago.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my issue on all of this is one, it's the weaponry of the language, and I don't use those terms anyway because they are meant to weaponize. I don't use the term cancel culture because it's a talking point, right? Is it climate change or is it global warming? Is it wokeness? Like all of these different terms, like my problem with all of them is their ubiquitous use without recognizing or without realizing, like fake news. I don't use that term. Fake news is an offensive fucking term to me as a journalist because fake news is designed to undermine my profession, right? So therefore, just by taking these terminologies and using them as mainstream, identity politics, all of these terms are not neutral terms. They are terms to undermine. And the very people who they are used to undermine have also adopted them, right? There's a war going on right here. They don't call it a culture war for nothing. There is a battle taking place to sort of shape what is happening in this culture. And to me, it so often does still stem from, if we take all the temperature down, it still stems from a certain offense, right? We're not to be talking about Aaron Rodgers, except for what Aaron Rodgers did. No one's talking about Dave Chappelle except for what Dave Chappelle did. And if we're talking about that, then you need to examine what's being said, why it's being said, what is the harm, is there harm, right? You may conclude that what Dave Chappelle said was just humor and get over it and it was funny and that's that. You may also conclude that he's attacking a certain community and that community doesn't feel like being attacked, right? I mean, there is something else taking place and it's not just the words themselves. The words are the weapons.
How much of this is cult of personality, right? The idea of who's saying it versus what's being said. The idea that, for instance, Dave Chappelle, I'm one of the people that I watched the special. I thought it was funny. I thought I understood a point that he was making that fell on deaf ears, in some cases figuratively deaf ears, people who weren't trying to hear whatever he was saying and just taking it in the context of, oh, he hates transgender people, ipso facto, this is more transgender hate. And then there were people who fell on deaf ears who literally didn't watch the special but had deep and thorough critiques of it. I'm not talking about
what you gonna do with that though,
right? But I'm just saying. So from that standpoint, like I'll give you Dan told me, his thing about it was, I just thought it wasn't up to the standard that I expected David Chappelle, and that other people that he had talked to who are in the comedy world felt similarly. And I just thought to myself, I said, they could be wrong. Oscar Robertson didn't think what Steph Curry did 5 years ago was a big deal. Oscar Robertson is one of the greatest players ever, knows more about basketball than all of us, and he could still be mistaken about this. And so this not me saying that Dave is absolutely right, but it is the idea that because it's Dave Chappelle as opposed to Carlos Mencia, I don't know, there is a level on both ends. There's a level of what he can get away with. I took it as Dave Chappelle's really funny and really smart and thinks about things in a different way. And there's also a level of, does he have a responsibility to speak in a way that even on its surface may not be toxic, but might inspire toxicity, which is one of the big critiques I would say that I've heard about his special.
There's another word. There's another word, by the way, toxicity.
Toxicity?
Toxicity. Another word that I feel like is being robbed of its meaning. But Howard,
poison?
Please.
Where do I go? What's
right. No, I know. Amin, I wasn't judging you,
No, what I was going to say is, once again, since this is a conversation about language, the reason why it bothered me was because, one, Dave Chappelle hasn't been canceled. right? I mean, he's alive and well and thriving and rich, and began his special by saying, I'm rich and famous, right? So he's dog whistling by talking about this. What he's really saying is, you can't say the things that I just said. He was paid for his special. The issue that I had, I mean, I don't even want to talk about the special. We already talked about it. To me, the problem was that it wasn't funny. I just didn't. There wasn't. Usually there is and I got what his point was. I didn't look at this and go, oh my goodness, I don't understand what he's trying to say. He's just beyond me. I understood what he was saying.
Well, no one ever says they don't understand. No one ever says.
But I did understand what he was saying. What he was saying was, and where I actually thought that there was a lot of value in what he was saying, is that white people get to check in and check out whenever they want. Right? And he's saying that about the trans community, and he's also saying that about the gay community. But there was a lot of black, trans, black, gay commentary that he left out. He trampled that community, his own people. Right? So there's a lot of the critique was coming from them, which I thought was really insightful. But I thought that the point that I'm trying to get at here is, it's not simply what you're saying, it's the terminology in which you're using. And if you are going to refer to yourself as canceled, right, you are speaking to a specific dynamic and a specific demographic and a specific political point that stirs a level of sort of faux populism, right, which is no different. And that populism right now is very much geared toward people who chose to tackle the powerful people, right? Like, if you're canceled, why? Like, starts with Me Too, right? So women finally come back and say, hey, you can't be doing this Bill Cosby shit to us anymore. And then the men say, you're canceling us, right? I mean, the reaction and the terminology is to a very specific thing, which is powerful people finally getting called out on what they've been doing. So the terminology can't be separated from the action, right? Because if you're really talking about somebody being canceled, where's Antonio Cromartie? Where's Colin Kaepernick? Where people who actually have lost things? They actually lost a lot, right? But they were going against the mainstream. And the mainstream is okay with getting rid of people that don't stick with it.
I think when we're talking about Chappelle, Aaron Rodgers, I mean, Joe Rogan comes into play here because, Aaron Rodgers name checked him. There's this obsession right now with contrarianism and framed as quote unquote independent thinking. It almost
Free Thinkers Unite
seems like the way to get points on one side of the equation and to build up an audience is just to be a contrarian about everything. Just like you could argue that the moral high horsing, the moral signaling that people accuse the left of, it was like, oh, on every topic that comes into the news cycle, if you take one certain opinion, you get points scored. I'm scoring points. On the other, the opposite of that right now is just being a contrarian about everything. Staking out a position on whatever comes into the news cycle as being as far away from whatever the consensus is, even if you don't believe that shit. I mean, I did a radio show for years with Will Cain. Like, even if you don't believe that shit, that's your identity now. That's your play. And we see this happening just as much on one side of the equation as you do on the other. That, like, this concept of like, and we know this as journalists, one of the first things I was taught is if you walk into a locker room and there's 20 reporters around one guy, don't be the 21st. Go away from that and go find some other story. So it's always like, well, if the crowd is going that way, you go the other way. And now it's this idea that, like, well, if the general consensus is this thing, I have to be a contrarian, and that is my brand. And that is and even if it's fucking ludicrous. Sometimes I question, because people question whether people who call themselves, liberals, whether they believe some of the shit they say, right? That gets called into question. Are you just saying those things because you want to be aligned with certain people, or do you believe it at every level? That's happening just as much in the communities we're talking about with, like, Joe Rogan. I don't know, I don't know about Dave Chappelle, but certain other people that we're talking about in that community, just being against something is points scored now.
Yes, and I think it ties into what Howard was talking about, where when you fight the mainstream, that the dissidents are easily crushed because it's the mainstream. But when the opposite is happening, now it's more apparent. And so because these people are not used to being on the losing side of that battle.
They're framing themselves as the underdog. And it's strange because it's the mainstream.
Exactly.
Joe Rogan's framing himself as the fucking underdog. And I'm like, who? Aaron Rodgers runs into the stadium on Sunday? Fucking cheers.
Yeah.
It'll be 80,000 people cheering. But yet the position is that he is the underdog in speaking truth to power. It's all inverted.
Yeah, but you know what though, Kate, what it is that, what does it say to you? I mean, what it says to me is that there is a massive disaffection that people have in this country, right? That people do not feel like they're being heard. That's one of the things that online has done in the past 20 years. Everybody can talk.
Yep.
There's no filter, right? So there are these places now where people feel like they can go, where they feel like they're going to be heard, like the old phrase that you came home and you kicked the dog. Amin wants to go. I see the hands.
Yeah.
If you're talking with your hands,
Amin,
I'm going to yield my time. Go do it.
Part of it also is the metricization of speech, right? It used to be you say something, so many people heard it in the town square or whatever. Or you went on the news and you said something, whatever. Now, I tweet something, and I know immediately how many people replied, how many people retweeted, how many people quote tweeted. If I said a tweet had 100,000 retweets, that sounds like a lot, right?
Yeah.
Right? 100,000 retweets. But what does that really mean? How many actual people is that? So you ask, Kate.
I was going to say, I mean, it reminds me of a meeting we had at ESPN. Kate, I don't think you were in that meeting because it was baseball. I don't remember you being there. We were talking about our baseball coverage, and everybody was trying to figure out how we were going to leverage Facebook and Twitter and sending out our stories. And finally, it was our social media director that came out and said, in order for one tweet to have any impact at all, it has to be tweeted like 50 million times. In other words, it has no impact. That is one gigantic echo chamber, and in the gigantic scheme of things, in terms of the things that move the needle, this stuff doesn't matter. And that's why I think the point that I was trying to get to, but what?
But that's not what these people believe.
Well, and it's not what
Aaron
these people
Rodgers'
believe.
mind. Right.
But the reason for that is because it actually does matter now, because people are making business decisions based on tweets.
Yes.
People are losing things over tweets. And that's why I go back and I say, it's the same white people in power, these old, making the decisions. Who's making the call? Mm-hmm. The same people that are making the call to cancel are the same people bitching about canceling, right? Because like, the big thing on Twitter is like, how come Twitter doesn't have an edit button? Because it's trying to get you fired. Because people are trying to use this as some form of
it's a gotcha.
Of public document that's gonna. Who said this in the meeting yesterday before we did this? When someone said like the first thing about getting drafted is, and they go look at the tweets when you were 13 years old. That was you, wasn't it? Exactly. Yeah. So that's what this has become, right? And so all of those things have to be taken in context. That there is a takedown mentality here. And so much of that takedown mentality is rooted in in a lot of this social media.
Amin, are you jumping back in here?
Yeah, no, I'm wondering, because one of the things I've always thought about also, because I see it a lot, is how much do people care? Really care, right? There are people who entrenched on either side. But then I think there's a mass in the middle that are just there for whatever we're doing this week.
Here for the popcorn.
Rachel Nichols is the worst human being alive. Everybody needs to get it. And then next week, nobody remembers, and they move on to the next thing. And it's not that they were offended on behalf of gender or race or sexual orientation or whatever the topic du jour was. It's another public execution that we get to pat ourselves on the back and say, I'm not awful like that.
No, it's gossip.
But how far outside of the media world, we can come up with examples where people genuinely, like Rachel, the real life implications, Rachel Nichols, real life implications
right.
to that media storm. Outside of media, and that's why it's like we've created this whirlpool that we live in and then we sometimes drown in. Mm-hmm. Outside of media, and we can come up with examples where people who had roles in like Marvel Universe, but then said something that Hollywood culture deemed unsavory, then they get dropped from a role. But that's all part of media,
right?
Outside of that, who is in the occasional Justine Stacco from 8 years ago? Single digits of like who's genuinely losing their job, other than we've created this media whirlpool and then we're in it.
Oof, that's
why these terms. That's why I don't use these terms. I don't think they're accurate. I think the weaponizing of it really can't be underestimated. Right? I mean, this is one of the things that when you're hearing all of this stuff, where is the accuracy level? And that's why, to me, what it really is it's a backlash. It's a political backlash. It's a social backlash against people who for most of our lives had to sit and take it. And so I don't think that piece can be underestimated. And I also think that there is a resistance to so much of what's happening right now, because you do have to have a certain level of standard. And you were asking earlier, Kate, do we believe, the three of us, do we believe that there are things you can't say? Absolutely there are things you can't say. 100%. 100%. There are things you can't say. The question to me is, why can't you say them? I'm a big boy. I can handle it. I'm not trying to get anybody fired. And I don't think people should lose their jobs necessarily for saying what they say. However, that being the case, there are certain things within what's being said where you should absolutely lose your job, especially if you're in control of policy, especially if you're in control of other people, especially if you're in control of hiring, and especially if you're someone who is espousing certain language or certain positions that require you not to have a job. So to me, I don't think you can separate the terminology from the acts, right? I mean, nobody who is talking about cancel culture is talking about that from someone like a Colin Kaepernick. And why is that? Because they want him canceled, right? They want him to lose his job. They did not want him in the first place. So what does it say about you, and what does it say about us if we're going to adopt this weaponized terminology when you know exactly who it's intended to hurt? Right? I mean, we know what the terms are for. The terms are not for injustice. The terms are for people in power, whoever they are, whether it's man more powerful than woman, whether it's white more powerful than black, whether it's straight more powerful than gay, rich more powerful than poor, whatever it is used as a protection when they shit on you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then they can say, oh, the world is just so woke because I said something that I'm using to hurt people. And it's okay for you to use it to hurt me in the past because you always could. And I'm one of those people that really does not believe. Like, people will say, like, we talk about this stuff all the time. You'll get is that a fireable offense? Most times the answer is no. Of course it's not a fireable offense, and most times people don't get fired. And usually people do bounce back or whatever. And if they do get fired, if they do get bounced, normally what they're getting bounced for is usually something different from what they said, which is their contract is either up or people were tired of them in the first place. And all of these things sort of become something different. right? And I think that's one of the reasons why I just feel like when we fall into the language itself is the weapon, and you can't use that weaponry against yourself, and we do it all the time.
What's the solution?
Well, yeah, because I'm thinking now that, like, you know, when we started the conversation, I was saying that, you know, take a word like, you know, trigger or privilege, and I tried to use different language to explain what I mean by those terms.
Well, it's anti-intellectualism right there, right, Kate? I mean, like, why can't you use the term trigger? Because people now associate that word with some sort of college egghead microaggression, like whatever term, whatever we're using, right? Safe space, like, you know, we have all the terms for all the different constituencies that those words are used to attack, right?
Yeah.
So
now we look at the words that we're talking about, right? Because you know, Howard, I'm not going to like lecture you on the origin of stay woke because you know it, and I mean, I'm sure you do too. But like, it used to mean something,
but now it means something else. It has a specific meaning now.
Yeah.
I mean, is there anything more? Is there any greater identity politics than white Christian politics?
Right, and that's
right?
that's the biggest thing, like that. I think it's overlooked when you have casual sports fan, woke mob, cancel culture, this firm belief that so many people have that Black people are playing identity politics, gay people are playing identity politics, but that the people who are actually in power aren't part of any identity, that they're not playing identity politics.
That's whiteness.
Like,
Did you?
Yeah,
but you saw that with the Ahmaud Arbery case, right? Like the New York Times, or the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times piece talked in specific detail about how choosing that jury was designed to get rid of bias, and the end result was an all-white jury, or an almost all-white jury. And I'm like, well, what does that tell you? That tells you what we've always known, is that white people think they're the neutral arbiters. They actually believe that they're the fair ones, right?
They believe that. They believe that, Howard, because the country was founded upon the principle that they are the default. And anything that steps out of white, Christian, you know, straight, is the exotic thing. People of color.
Or the dangerous thing.
Sexual orientation.
The threatening thing.
Yes, dangerous, threatening, and simultaneously also incapable of impartiality.
Yep.
Well, that's right. I remember this is actually a really not funny story. I remember the jury after the four policemen who had beaten Rodney King. Mm-hmm. And when they were, I'm sorry, no, it was OJ. It was OJ. That's what it was. After the OJ verdict, I was at the San Jose Mercury News. And I remember one of my editors, and an editor who brought me into the business, a mentor, one of the people, when you say, okay, who are the people who started your career? Who took an interest in your success? I'm sitting in his office, and he said to me, this verdict is simply proof that Black people are incapable of administering justice. I'll never forget that sentence until the day I die. And I'm thinking, Black people convict Black people all the time. And have you ever heard of Emmett Till? You know, this idea of who is the neutral arbiter, who is the fair one. And you hear it from white people all the time. I don't care about black, white, or purple. I just care about justice. And I feel like saying, go fuck yourself.
Don't bleep that one, Witty. Leave that one in.